Okay, so welcome to the first real lesson for advanced placement world history. This is where our test content starts. So today we're focusing on topic 1.0, where we're going to focus on the context of the post classical age. And what you need to be able to do by the end of this lesson is answer this question: what was the context for the post classical age? So when we look at how we're going to go about answering this question, the first part of this video is going to define what context is. Then we're going to describe the context for the post-classical age, and we're going to end it with describing what is going on from 1200 to 1450. So we begin with what is context. Before I get into explaining, I want you to take a look at this picture. This is a work of art that was produced in the 1990s, and it relates to the 1900 to 2010 time period. Toward the end of that time period, we see massive globalization, not just globalization in economics, but globalization in politics, globalization in social structures, and especially globalization in culture. So in this picture, what we see, obviously, an African young man is working in the coffee fields, but he has this I Hate Mondays t shirt on. So this represents the globalization of culture because we do see unique elements of African daily life, but also we see evidence of a spread of a global culture. That's what contextualization is. So, to explain it a little bit better, what we're talking about is the setting. So, when we first describe the setting, we're looking at describing the developments, the processes that are occurring in the world at that time period. And we're connecting the specific topic of what we're studying to those overall global things. Now, when we contextualize in history, the very first thing we talk about is the things being events, development, and processes that led up to what we're focusing on. And then the second thing that we're doing it is we're connecting that event, development, and process to the global. Now, by no means do I expect you to be an expert on this at the end of this video. This is just introduction. But what I'm doing through this lesson is I'm showing you how to contextualize. So we've defined context. Now let's take that idea about establishing and connecting to the setting to what we're studying. So our next step of the lesson is going to describe the context for the post-classical age. The post-classical age, this is our first time period in history, begins in 1200 and lasts to 1450. And this is going to be divided into two units of focus. We have Unit 1, the global tapestry, and we have Unit 2, the Afro-Eurasian web. So what we're seeing during this time period is from 1200 to 1450, we have new states and empires in Afro-Eurasia and the Americas who are going to develop new political systems. These new political systems seek to unify, rule, and provide for their populations over greater distances. Sometimes they reach back to the past and use them. Sometimes they develop new ones. But what we're really focusing on, first off, is the government. Also, during this time period, these new states and empires are going to interact, and they're going to interact through trade, mostly across Afro-Eurasia. And this is going to lead to deeper and wider economic, technological, and cultural and biological exchanges between these new states. So, on one hand, between 1200 and 1450, we see new states that unified, ruled, and provided. And then on the second hand, we see great interaction, trade, that's going to not only spread economic goods, but also technological, cultural, and biological exchanges. So that's what we're talking about. But when we contextualize, we got to talk about what led up to this. So we go all the way back to the classical age. During the classical age, we have our first age of huge empires. So as you can see from this map, between 600 BCE and 600 CE, you have these huge empires that inhabited great parts of the world. You start off all the way to the right, where you have the Han Dynasty of China. Then India during this time period is unified by the Guptas. In the Middle East, we see the Persians. And in Europe and the Mediterranean, we see the Roman Empire. In the Americas to the left, we do see an empire. It's smaller. It's called the Mayan Empire. The point being is between 600 and 600, we see these large empires that rule these huge areas. And yes, these areas in Afro-Eurasia, meaning Africa, Europe, and Asia, did conduct trade between each other. Now, unfortunately, by 600, all of the empires that you see here are going to collapse. As a matter of fact, it was a very rapid collapse, which began in 476, and by 600, they're all gone. Now, when you talk about collapse, you've got internal and you've got external. Well, a lot of these empires internally collapsed because of poor economies and a lack of unities. This is also the time period where we see a lot of new monotheistic religions, being Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism. They're all competing. A little bit of a side note. The religion of Islam does not come until after this time period. We're going to talk about that a little bit later in the unit. But the point being is these empires could no longer unify their population. And their governments, they couldn't rule anymore. They couldn't collect taxes. Now, probably the biggest thing externally is they were invaded. You can see the arrows. You see the Germans invaded Rome. You see the Huns invading Rome and Persia. You see the White Huns invading India. You see another group of Huns invading China. So these governments not only internally couldn't rule their populations, externally they couldn't protect it. So this what it was like in the last days of these empires, a lot of warfare. The Germans in the upper left, they're attacking and burning Rome. The Yellow Turban Revolt in Han China attacked and decimated the area. And then the White Huns attacked the Guptas and caused their downfall. The bottom line is this: all of these empires collapse. So far, what we've established is this. First of all, we used to have these great classical empires that were very successful, but due to internal reasons where they could no longer govern their populations and external invasions and the lack of protection, all of these empires collapsed. Now, what this causes is this: we have a great amount of backwardness. Life becomes more focused on basic survival and less on living a nice life. This is across the board in every area. Learning, intellectual, and technological development almost stopped, and long distance trade came to a screeching halt, mostly because it was unsafe. You were always worried about starving to death or getting attacked. But as we get closer to 1200, things begin to change. Now, obviously in 1200, we see the rise of new states and empires. But why? Why did people decide to live in these states and empires? Well, first of all, those that got conquered really didn't have a choice. But when you look at the positives of living in a larger state or empire, well, first of all, it's a lot safer. Second of all, it's a lot easier to get what you need and want to survive. So the people began to buy into these, and what we see is the development of new states and empires. So in the lesson, we've defined context, the setting. We've described how we went from the classical collapse to these new states in 1200. Our last step is to talk about, well, what is going on, the local. We know that from 1200 to 1450, new states and empires in Afro-Eurasia and the Americas used past and new political processes to unify, rule, and provide for their populations over greater distances. These new states and empires interacted through trade across Afro-Eurasia. So let's focus on the political. When we talk about Unit 1, also known as the Global Tapestry, what we're doing is we're visiting the 6 main regions where we see these new governments. We begin with Song China, move to Dar al-Islam in the Abbasid Empire, focus on South and Southeast Asia and their trading states, Sub-Saharan Africa, where is a new area of state development through states in the Sahel and Swahili East Africa, visiting the Aztecs and the Incas, and finally ending with a study in Europe. So in all of these, what we're first of all looking at is how they unified, how they ruled, and how they provided, so we can build some comparisons. So this is what the global tapestry of it is about. Remember, the global tapestry is Unit 1 of the post-classical age. So our focus is looking at the world like a work of art. This is a tapestry. And we know that a tapestry has many unique designs, but together they make a big picture. So when we apply this and look at the world, we know that everybody's unifying, ruling, and providing, but they're doing it in their unique ways. That's what we're studying. So when we talk about unifying, we're looking at coming up with a state religion. And the state religion is important because it provides us with common ideas, common practices, and common right and wrong. This unity is very important because you're dealing still with a lot of multicultural people. When we create the government, the first thing we do, we have to legitimize it. We have to prove to the people that they have the right to rule. And we've got to create a highly educated group called the bureaucracy, which is going to do the day-to-day operations. And then finally, when we provide, the government's going to create an economy. Most importantly, a market economy. A market economy is based on trade and based in money. So the first thing you have to do is you have to increase agricultural production, allow people to specialize in things other than agriculture, and then promote trade. So when we look at the big picture, to sum all this up, the first thing that we learned was that we defined context. Context is the setting, and in establishing the setting, we're doing two things. We're talking about the events, the developments, and the processes that led up to what we're studying, and we're connecting what we're talking about into that development. So when we describe the context for the post-classical age, we start off with the classical age. We had empires. Now, unfortunately, these empires collapsed due to internal and external problems. But after they collapsed in 600, people began to gravitate towards states. So what happens in 1200 is that we have new states and new empires developing in East Asia, South and Southeast Asia, Dar al-Islam, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Americas, and Europe that unify, that provide, and rule their populations.